for sure. If you are able to, I would just as a backup, but I think
Okay. Can everybody see my screen?
yes.
Cool. This is Coconut. She's a mix of, I think, Chihuahua and Corgi, and she's 16. Anna knows her, Eric knows her. But basically, she hangs out all day looking at empty space. And like, what I think is interesting from this video is that she's looking at the wall. So basically at nothing, right? Here is another set of people who are also looking at the wall. A wall that only has wallpaper, nothing to look at, no artwork. And so I could say that the dog is senile, and so that's why she's looking at the wall or looking out into empty space. And I could say that this guy, Paul Nouget, who was born in 1895 and producing this series in the 1930s, produced this image because he was working from a surrealist perspective. All of those things are true, but also I think there's kind of like a method behind it. And the real question that I want to ask myself, or that I've been asking myself, and it's been taking many shapes and many different focuses throughout the years, is what happens if we look at nothing, right? What happens if we look at the empty wall? What happens if we look at these membranes, these curtains that are apparently are superficial and that there's nothing inside, no content? Yeah, what can we find? So it interests me. They're not looking at the sublime of the landscape. They're not looking at works of art. They're not looking at people walking around, walking in the street. They're more like looking to the great beyond. And I think the last time I saw that was in Cuba in 2013, and I was very surprised because I'm always looking at a screen. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. And now that I sort of talked about this idea of a method, which is what happens if we look to the things that apparently are contentless or superficial. And so this lecture has a title that comes from an exhibition idea that I had, and it's unrealized. And I want to just read like a little bit of some of the sentences that I had been writing for the show, trying to summarize why it was important for me to think about the poetics of membranes and walls and curtains. So I wrote, this exhibition deals with the curtain as museographical device and as a metaphor to incite a conversation about separation. From the most recent update of the Iron Curtain concept, which separates us from this other, quote, I quote, the other, that is now Russia, but that has changed over the centuries, to the act of veiling information through smoke and mirrors and fake news. This exhibition incites a rethinking around the boundaries we set on things and looks to explode the ever-present binary that rules our way of relating to the world. So while we are in the midst of a war between Russia and Ukraine, it feels like the Cold War has never ended. And following the centuries-long tradition of European modernism, the Cold War created the ultimate polarizing conflict, inflicting laws of separation and othering on a global scale. And while it becomes more and more evident that this logic is still in place in 2022, that was the year where I was writing this, a rethinking around these binary laws of separation that perpetuate the good versus bad logic seems urgent. Newer generations of young thinkers are increasingly addressing binarism or binaries through gender. This recently formed awareness is percolating into our daily language and visibilizing identities that do not ascribe to the masculine and feminine imperative. So what can a diverse roster of artists from around the world add to a conversation on these large subjects? So yeah, this is sort of like what I was thinking about. And, at the time, this exhibition proposal started around like 2020. And, I can say that the things that I've been thinking about and researching are very dear to my heart, but they haven't really ever translated into a show. So I think this is the way that it's like that all of these ideas together are going to be shown. And so I've seen like a meme going around Instagram that is like, oh, what happens when you look at the void? And it's like the void stares back at you. And I don't know if that comes from like a philosopher or something, but I think the idea of looking at something and then being looked at back is really important for like my practice right now, and sort of like directing the gaze and the attention to these things that are often overlooked or invisibilized. And so I've been thinking also about a work that I saw like 2 years ago at SAIC Galleries. I'm going to share my screen again. So here we go. So this is a work by a Danish artist called The Gaze. And it's basically 7 minutes of people looking back at you. And of course, as you can see, they're all people of color. And this has to do with like what I'm proposing. Okay. I'm gonna stop sharing again. And so within these actions of looking back, I think in this context today, we would be like more looking at the apparently neutral white wall that is like omnipresent in our lives, in our homes, in art spaces, in magazines, in shops, everything. So this wall that is there to make the rest of the world disappear, and to see what is inside this wall. What does it contain?
Is she here or not? No, but she's speaking live. She's on Zoom. Where's New York? Hi. I don't know if she can see.
Okay. So a while ago, I had this idea to create a magazine that, or like an art journal or something like that, that would like look at the stories of art spaces, not through like what the founders or the owners or the people working there were telling about the space, or like the discourse that had been written about the space, or like the curatorial framework that had been like, thought about, and their mission and everything, but actually about what had happened in those walls. So you can see like, sorry, I can hear what people are saying, and like I can hear you. I can kind of hear you, but like not completely. So I don't know if you're talking to me or you're talking amongst yourselves.
No, among ourselves.
Okay. So I think what was interesting to me was like, what if we like create a narrative of the spaces more about what has happened inside rather than what like has been communicated from the outside, and that would take like recollections from other people, or like different kinds of history making, more about like think about histories rather than history. That's not super relevant right now, but I just want to show you another work. And I know it's annoying that I'm sharing and unsharing. So this is a work that I had the opportunity to show in Bogota in 2016. And it's like a very simple gesture. It's just like a sheet of like, I don't know how you call it, like drywall mesh or I don't know. It's like not stuck onto the actual wall, but like separated. And the edges are lit up with LED lights. And I just think it's great. It like reminds me of like 80s sci-fi movies. And it just sort of makes me think that there's something inside, right? There's something inside that wall. And I want us to think about like the wall as space. So a wall, a curtain, a membrane is not simply what is separating space one from space two. It is a space in itself, even if it's like a superficial small space. It is a materialization of ideas, right? Of like something that has to be separated. Goes back into like, why do those two things have to be separated? Why one thing is the outside and the other thing is the inside? And of course, like I thought about like Brian O'Doherty's writings. I'm not gonna go into detail about it because I know this is somebody that people read, but it is important because he was the first one to actually think about like, okay, how are these abstract works being shown and what does it mean that we're thinking about artwork and producing it in relation to this context that is the white cube. So what is behind this idea of the white, right? It's this idea of like the disembodied I, the spectator that is losing like his corporality once he goes in there. It talks about transcendence, spirituality. It is like a space that has inherited things from churches, cathedrals, and these sort of like devotional spaces. So the wall is space. It's creating a third space. One space, a second space that are being separated by a third space. What is it? We don't know. But so the white cube is separated by something from the black box, which are completely different kinds of spaces. One is completely bodily, and the other one is the opposite, right? It's like the like deleting the body or like taking the body out, separating it from the gaze and the eye. I think I'm gonna start reading again. Oh no, I'm not. I'm just gonna show you this image. This is from an exhibition that I curated in 2018 in Bogota. It was called Under the Sun Exactly. And it was about specificity of location and dislocation. So I was playing with this idea of the white cube and things in Colombia that are called or that have names that have nothing to do like where this to do with like the space where they are, or this obsession in South America to like name things after things in North America or Europe. So that's why this background is like a place in the middle of Colombia and it says Europe, because that's the name of this. That's how the owners of that space named their house or their lot or whatever, or their field. And so as I was thinking through this show, I went to a residency where I met an amazing philosopher whose name is Nicola Masciandaro. He lives in New York. And he is a medievalist, and his specialty is mystic philosophy. So it's very like it's very, it's like, it's religious, but it's also like supernatural in a way. But anyway, so within his research of mystic medieval writings, he wrote a text called the Firebox. And so what the Firebox says is that there can be like a third space between the white cube and the black box called the Firebox, which essentially is a melting pot or like a crucible, and the fire sort of melts the two together and creates something new altogether. But before I go into depth on the on the Firebox, I want to go back a little bit to the white cube. So I was thinking as well as space. I was thinking about like, okay, like let's take out this pristine thing here in the white cube, in the white wall. There's something inside. There's light coming out of it. The wall is a space. And here we have people in Colombia naming their houses after Europe or New York or whatever. And within this show that I told you about, Under the Sun Exactly, I decided to cover the whole white walls with a mural. So basically what I wanted to do was to like submerge the exhibition space, obviously symbolically, underground. And so, you know, Oroherty talks about the mural. He says that it does some things about, he does some things in relation to like point of view, or like in the way we see art. I mean, very technical things, but what I'm interested in is what happens when the work is not surrounded by pristine walls, pristine white walls. And also, like, in this context of making this show in Colombia, what does it mean to like see skeletons of people in this sort of like symbolically buried exhibition space? And here we have the Archaeological Museum in Bogota. And if you've ever been to like South America or Latin America, usually there are a lot of colonial buildings that are being preserved in a way. And through those preservation efforts, they start to discover the actual frescoes and murals that were in these buildings from the 16th to 17th to 18th century. So essentially, it's crazy for me to see that, because I think of like these sort of colonial constructions as being white, right? The walls are white. But when these buildings become government buildings and when they become important, these sort of like endeavors start to happen. I think these murals are really hard to uncover. Like, imagine centuries and centuries of white paint. But like, you know, like the question that I was asking myself was like, when did people start to paint the walls white? And I didn't care about Europe. I didn't care like, okay, the Bauhaus, whatever kind of like European history. Like, when in Colombia, somebody that owned a colonial building decided that they wanted to cover the murals with white paint. And so that's a history that's really hard to uncover. I would have to like talk to the archaeologists and ask things like, okay, so like the next layer of paint after the mural, what kind of paint was it? When was it done? What color was it? But that data is not readily available. So it's very speculative. And I was asking myself that question for a long time. And, I didn't really have an answer, but like I still ask myself, like, why would it mean for us to live in spaces that have murals? Because all of these buildings were domestic spaces. So essentially, they were kind of like recreating nature inside architecture that was normal. And when did we decide that domestic spaces also had to recreate the white cube? And yeah, I mean, there's many like colonial buildings, right? But this one is crazy because it's an archaeological museum where you have like, right, the colonial architecture and all these things from the Spanish. And inside there are all these sort of like indigenous artifacts that are shown in very like Western-y white cube, in that way, sort of like museological, museum-worthy sort of like pedestals, albeit without the white walls, which I think is cool. But and this is where I've seen some of the coolest murals. So I mean, this is a window here, and this clearly like the window on the left is clearly like the original window, but like these guys decided that they would recreate the window to the right, which I think is crazy. But then that mural is incomplete, so that window must have not been there back then. I don't know, a lot of questions that don't have answers from our Spanish colonizers. And so yeah, and I want to show you this photo because I couldn't really find like a good one, but colonial walls were really, really thick. Like, I don't know, like 3 or 2 feet thick, because they would make them in this thing called adobe, which is like essentially it's like earth and water, and like I don't really know how to explain it in English, but it's this material that sort of like expands and contracts with weather. So it was really practical, and it's very resistant. So like these things are still standing after like 500 years, 400 years. But they're really, really, really thick. And one of the reasons why I like morbidly love to go to these buildings is because I always heard legends. Oh yeah, here we can see it. See, like the distance between the wall and the window is huge. It's really thick. But so like the legend was that some people had found skeletons inside the walls. So I would go to these buildings thinking like, oh my God, maybe there's a skeleton here. Or like, wow, did someone really fuck it up that like they had to be buried in the house, like inside the walls. And that's just another way of thinking like, okay, these walls are really thick and people were buried in there, which reminds me also of this, right? Like, but it kind of makes me like think again, like wall is space. Wall is space. There's a space inside. It says things. So yeah, and the white walls came in, destroyed the murals, and during this time, during colonial times, is when white as a synonym of cleanliness became a thing. So I could look for the data, like the historical data, which really doesn't interest me right now, but it came a time when people would literally eat out of these ceramic plates. And then after a certain moment, through a certain Spanish rule or a Spanish kingdom, that was like increasingly forbidden because it was thought that it was non-hygienic or like unhygienic. And so dishes China became white. And that's how the difference between like Spanish and non-Spanish would be marked, among many other things. But so like the white started to signify more and more and more until eventually it took over the walls. Um, um, yeah, so dead people inside the walls. I wanted to read a little bit of the Firebox, this text by Masciandaro, the medievalist philosopher, because he explains a little bit what the Firebox could be. And so, quote, the white box or the white cube is anemic, sterile, and boring. And the black box is plethoric, rotting, and excited. They are dual sides of the same coin, to be melted down, tossed into where it already is, the burning X of fire. To cast the white/black box in this way, to liquefy in the crucible that shapes its sides, means to track the eye beyond the illusion of spectatorial space. The notion of there being places in which to see and to be seen, a fundamental projection of the eye, whose life is nothing other than the daily show of being its own audience. To see and seize fire rather than achromatic color as the container and carrier of vision means to restore the eye to its own principle and invisibility, to curve it back around the omnipresent specular point where seer and seen coincide, to convert or bend it in the fire of which all we see is only the flames. So again, this is very philosophical, but I think it's beautiful because by creating images, I think you can create reality. And that makes me think like, okay, so what's the Firebox actually feel like? If we're talking about like exhibition spaces, like spaces for art, how can I, as curator, recreate this space? Or think about this space in real life? What are the small gestures or the small mental images that will take me there eventually? See, this is the quote that I just read, which is really beautiful. And I wish you could read it, but that would be boring. But I want to show you the Firebox. Of course, this artist didn't think about the Firebox in the way that Masciandaro is thinking about it, but I just think it's cool. It's a great image. And so Masciandaro is thinking about the X, the burning X of fire, he says here. I just want to read this again. To see and seize fire rather than a chromatic color as a container and carrier of vision means to restore the eye to its own principle and invisibility, to curve it back around the omnipresent specular point where seer and seen coincide, to convert or bend it in the fire of which all we see is only the flames. Amazing. Okay, so now we go from the Firebox to the veil. So in 2020 is when I was thinking about this show, and I was collaborating with like a longtime collaborator and colleague, Pablo La Sala, and this show was like essentially about the curtain. So like the curtain as metaphor to think about other things, or the curtain as curatorial framework to choose work, right? To choose artists and projects. So as I said, it's an unrealized show. I don't think it'll ever be an exhibition. Maybe someday. It doesn't matter. But like really where the curtain starts interesting me is when I was thinking about the space or the interval between Isis, the goddess, the Egyptian goddess, this sort of like feminine goddess that was then like assimilated in Roman um, theology as Aphrodite, but she's like more than that. She's also like fertility goddess, etc. So like the space there was between Isis the goddess and Isis the terrorists, so like the Islamic State. Because that's another method of seeing things. Like if two things have the same name by coincidence, even if they're like very, very far removed, which at this time they might have even been like opposites, because Isis was destroying ancient temples. So they were actually like polytheism against monotheism. Even if they're opposites, there has to be something that ties them together. So like my endeavor was, again, in this project that is before the curtain exhibition. This was like before. This was 2017. So what I wanted to do is like bring them together. How can I prove that they have something in common and that the world works in mysterious ways? And sometimes its mysterious ways show themselves through language or through weird signs and coincidences. So an interval between Isis and Isis, and through this, I started to see an interest for veils, because women in the Islamic State or in other fundamentalist Muslim countries have to wear veils, burqa, niqab. I really like this photo when they're blue, when they have these blue burqas, hijab. I don't really know the subtleties between one and the other names, but I know they're very different. This photo is actually of ISIS women, or living with like ISIS members. And so they had veils, but ISIS also had veils. So in Egyptian representations of Isis, she did not have veils. She did appear sitting on a throne, which is like, it symbolizes that she is the base for all power. She would often appear like the throne itself. In hieroglyphs, she would be she was a throne. That's like the hieroglyph for Isis. But during the 19th century, in these currents of like hermeneutics, 19th century mysticism, English, American, think like Aleister Crowley sort of things, Isis reappeared in their lore, in their sort of like mythological, eclectic way of revisiting mysticism. And she appeared with veils because her veils contained the secret of nature, or like nature's secrets. So she had 1,000 veils, and only like the more initiated and the more wise and the more, I don't know, spiritual could start lifting those veils until the end, where they were like one with nature, or like they were like initiated in all these secrets. These movements are interesting because they are kind of happening at the same time as spiritualism in the States, which is something that I am a really big fan of. But here in the inscription that the statue has, it says, "Je suis ce qui a été." Anyway, it says in French, "I am what was, what is, and what will be, and no mortal has yet lifted the veil that covers me." So there you go, like the metaphor for spiritual initiation and mystical knowledge and wisdom in Isis. So these two Isis had veils. And so the veil became a really important mental image for me to think about what I was trying to do, trying to bridge these two opposite things that have the same name. Back to 2020, fast forward to 2020, thinking about this show on curtains. So I just explained why I was interested in curtains. Now I'm talking about the show in 2020 that I was planning. We came up with this idea for, I call it in Spanish, I call it museography. I know that you guys don't call it that. Let's say exhibition design or like whatever. How the walls were going to be designed for the artwork to be on. And so this is a double funnel, Funnel. So you see here, there's one funnel, and here there's another funnel. And so what that would symbolize, and maybe we were being a little bit like, I don't know, like too symbolic or whatever. Maybe that's why the show didn't happen. It doesn't matter. Is that the pyramid shape or like the funnel shape represents precisely this conception of knowledge as something that you have to like climb like a pyramid, right? So that only like the very best, the most exclusive would reach to the top, and that's where it starts. That's where it stops. Like you're closer to God. Like the Tower of Babel, I don't know how you call it in English. Sort of like monuments that are towering towards the sky to be closer to God. Very masculine conception of knowledge and understanding the spiritual. That's why this mural was also important to me, because I was like, what does it look like to create a monument or like be closer to divinity, not looking upwards but down? And in a way, like the mural versus the white is kind of the same thing, because the white sort of like takes you out of your body, and the mural sort of like and makes you more embodied. It has like this human bodily scale. So yeah, and the funnel by itself is that, and the double funnel, which is also an X, which is what Masciandaro was talking about, the X of fire. What it proposes is the melt. There's a melting point. There's a melting point there. So like when you reach the top, well, what happens? You're just gonna open it back up. So this idea of like climbing up to like divinity is not what we wanted to like get out of talking about curtains. In a way, you lift the curtain or you lift the veil, and there's no like exclusivity. There's more, right? There's gotta be something else. Especially if we're thinking about like the veil and the wall as a space in itself. And so I wrote, basically the space would be divided by these opposed pyramidal shapes, creating diagonal walls alongside which it would be the work of the artist, blah, blah, blah. And of course, these walls will create a certain level of opacity of isolated spaces, right? Because if this here is a wall, then there's this space, there's this space, there's this space, like, there's multiple like isolated exhibition rooms. The main idea, though, was to reflect, to symbolize that the veils of Isis can be imploded. Interesting word. So again, everything that I already talked about in 19th century mysticism and hermeneutics, a movement that was also either contemporary or incited by spiritualism. The veils of Isis symbolized mystical knowledge and wisdom, as they would be lifted up or would be, and one would be closer and closer to the secrets of nature. And so I was wondering, aren't there other ways to conceive of divinity and knowledge of nature that don't have to be exclusive? Which is what I feel about reading, sorry. But now I'm thinking about another sort of like binary. So this is a quote by an artist that one time wrote like an article about witchcraft and art, which was kind of a trending topic for a while. She says, witches' magic is the wisdom and practice of oppressed peoples. The occult is the organized keeping of secrets by those in power. Witches' magic is embodied knowledge. Occult magic is closer to black box military technology. And I didn't to include the writings of Silvia Federici here because a lot of people talk about her, but she is like essential to thinking about the relationship between, or like the difference between witchcraft and occultism, and the relationship between the creation of witchcraft or the creation of a concept of witchcraft as something pejorative, negative, and the creation of walls of separation. So not specifically creation of walls, but it's something that during the Middle Ages was called enclosures. So she basically traces the creation of enclosures and the end of communal plots of land to the creation, or like the manifestation of these women that were called witches. Because as they were losing these communal spaces that allowed them to live in a world without men, because a lot of them were widows or like sick or whatever. So as they lost this security to exist in the world, they dedicated themselves to other things like medicine, or things that people would call witchcraft. So society, European society at the time, basically did everything to eradicate these women because they were rebels. They were not like having it, and they would like openly rebel against the people who were creating these enclosures. So moving on. I just wanted to show these really cool ectoplasm photos. I show them in all my lectures. I'm not very original. I just show them because a lot of them, like ectoplasm is supposed to be the substance of a ghost manifesting in your body when you're in a trance state, if you're a medium, between the beyond and here. Medium seances were really popular at the beginning of the 20th century. But a lot of, I mean, it's not about like it being real or not. It's about the fact that they were recreated with cloth. A lot of them were recreated with cheesecloth. So, it's like an idea becomes cloth, like the idea that there are ghosts and they do manifest, and that there had to be like an imperative to show them because photography was being invented at the time. Well, it's the cloth that manifested, that materialized this idea. Something that really interests me. Okay, so we're back here. I don't know why. But okay, so the double funnel shape presents the idea that instead of knowledge, spiritual narrowing down to fewer people, it can be expanded. It also creates a neck shape in the space, and not so long ago, I attended a conversation around gender neutral language in Spanish, part of a series of programs curated for the show Amigues Radicales at the Clemente Center in New York City, where I'm working right now, curated by Sofia Reiser. And so the show was called Amigues Radicales. So like in Spanish, for those who don't know, a lot of substances are gendered, not like in English. So in English, you would essentially only need like to change the pronouns. In Spanish, it's necessary to change a lot of the gender words, which are usually substantives. So if you want to say amigos, like the word for friends, if you want to say the neutral, gender neutral version of the word, you would say amigues with an x, an x. So again, the X of fire. And I just wanted to read a little bit of something that I wrote about it. Um, So using an X to create, I don't even know how to say it in English, an X to create gender neutral substantives is a rising necessity for Spanish speakers who are adopting inclusive language. The highly gendered A for female and O for male terminations in Spanish words, which are being replaced with the X is a slightly starker linguistic transition than in English. And so the programming heavy show provided space to talk about the importance of adopting these linguistic addendums with a conversation led by Silvia Rivera Alfaro, who is a project right now at the Latinx Project in NYU. Members of Las Mariquitas, which is a trans and LGBTQ salsa band, it changes the game because salsa is a rhythm that is super patriarchal. And Camilo Godoy, a Colombian artist that lives here in New York, whose work is amazing, by the way. And so during the conversation, early attempts at gender fair language, such as the use of the at sign in the 90s, was the thing in the 90s, like you would say, like, amigo, to say the gender neutral version, it would be like AMIG and the at sign. During the 90s, blah, blah, blah. So movingly, Camilo Godoy, explained why the present use of the X is meaningful. What the at sign remits to technology and the virtual, the X follows the legacy of radical thinkers and activists like Malcolm X, who erased their last names to be emancipated from violent pasts and stands as a symbol of acceptance of both the unknown and X-rated content, so porn. But anyway, I think the X is important to these things that we're discussing, or that I am discussing by myself. Here's another little cute drawing that I made when I was thinking through the show and things that I was sharing with the artist. So a membrane, a cloth, a threshold. So essentially the whole question is like, how do I create the threshold? How do I create this third space? And now that we're thinking about the X, I'm going to show you guys a video. Stop share. Share again. Okay. Share. So I made this video a long time ago, but I was like really into thinking about like historical things, and I just felt like the 19th century was the same as the 21 and as the 21st century. So I made this cute animation. Come on. Sorry, again. But you got the idea. yeah, that's the video, but I guess it could be interpreted in many ways, but I was essentially just thinking like that Roman eye, that Roman one is like the membrane, right? Like the membrane that we're shifting around. But if it's still like separating the same things, or if it's still a membrane that's been placed there through the same ideological things or the same ideologies, then everything's just gonna mean the same. The 19th is the same as the 21st century, and like the Cold War never ended. Going back to my presentation here. And so yeah, I said we're still operating from a logic of binaries. That's why everything is still the same. Joseph is a friend of mine who works at SAIC and works in Chicago, and I really admire his work and his work ethic. And I am thinking here of his work because it's like work that employs or like uses minimalist language to talk about other things. To talk about what is it that we didn't see in a space, or what we're like erasing in a space, or what are like art, like cultural workers and art workers erasing from an exhibition space that we don't get to see. And so he's basically like showing it again, and these are drywalls, and he's just flipping the drywall so as he like fixes like a hole on the drywall, he patches it up, puts like compound thing or like whatever spackle on it. He's just showing like what is behind the wall and like how that accumulates over time. And this is like a fairly recent thing that I've been thinking about, because I've been thinking about the triangle, or like the love triangle, and the complicated relationship between audiences, artists, and institutions. And I'm going to read now, and the role that curators play in that equation. So are we standing up for audiences, institutions, or artists as curators? Or like me, that I consider myself a curator. And so I have been thinking about what gets shown and why, how it gets shown, and who tells our stories and how. And then going back to this idea of the magazine that I told you earlier about telling the story of a space, not through the official narrative about it, but through other things. How can we tell stories of spaces through a different lens, not through money or official funders' narratives, but through what hides beneath the walls, what gets stored, expelled, and erased when the white cube is set in motion? The installers, the art handlers, the past shows, the moments of install, right? When you're in during install, why doesn't that get recorded, right? Isn't that significant? Whatever is in storage, why do we never get to see that? And so I'm thinking about Joseph's way of grappling with the fact that he is an installer, a producer, and an art handler. And I'm also thinking about this installation that was produced in 2021 in the last project I did in Colombia before moving to Chicago. I curated this project with Natalia Gutierrez and Pablo La Sala and Estudio El Cajón, a design studio. It took place at the Museo del Banco in Colombia, and in that context of this project called Ghosts and Paratext, a translation from Spanish, we were examining the ghostliness of both virtual art experiences during pandemic times but also the ghost in museums, that which has been invisibilized by white paint, but that can sometimes be felt. Was really into this idea of like what cannot be seen but can be felt. And so as one of the main premises of the project was what it was like a 5-month residency that ended in a show. So as part of the show, we went into the storage and took out as many of the tables, plinths, old wall labels, took it out and exhibited everything as the artwork in the exhibition space. And so that was sort of like a gesture from us, the curators, and then the residents and the artists decided to paint it chroma key green. So it was a relational space for the show, undefining the white. So like taking out that specificity of the white cube white and triggering a poetic vanishing of the space, because chroma key green or whatever you put in the chroma can be anything, can be anywhere. It's also nothing, right? And this installation was called Remote Viewing Living Room. And so at the time, I was thinking about how to free the exhibition space from the separation between what must be shown and what must not be shown. Thinking also about the pressure that we have as cultural workers and artists of color to showcase and produce work around our racial and ethnic identities. And because this is the latest thing that I've been thinking about, because I'm really like shocked and displeased by the way everything is shown or like defined through these categories of identity politics, like are you Latina, are you Black, are you blah blah blah, and the way art gets funded through those same categories. I stumbled upon the figure, metaphor, and image of the forest. And in a way, it has started to occupy a similar space in the mental images that I work with, than the wall, than the curtain and the veil. The forest is sort of a new one. And I was thinking about it back in 2020, but now it sort of like became more important. So initially, I was thinking about how the forest, the jungle, and the geography in Colombia are a kind of wall. They're a kind of curtain. They're a membrane that has to be pierced. Because there's like the Andes, there's valleys, there's jungles, there's many things. And so our country is like disjointed. I think that's the case for like a lot of South American countries. But this guy here was a scientist, active at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. He was killed by the Spanish when they attempted to reconquer the territory. But among his like scientific endeavors, he did pretty fucked up things for our country. So he was very much into the scientific positivism vibe, which means that they were like basically trying to prove racist things through science. They weren't trying to prove racist things. They were trying to like mobilize racist thinking and prove it through science. So what this guy said is that the people who lived in the lower or hotter regions in Colombia were not like well adapted for development. And the ones who lived in the higher altitudes were adapted to development or for like productivity. This is a text that he wrote in Spanish. Is called Del influjo del clima sobre los seres civilizados, which like roughly translates into English like on the influence of the climate on civilized beings, basically saying that the people who didn't live up in the mountains where it was cold, like in Europe, they were not apt or built for being productive. So that they were like lazy and stupid, blah, 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 blah. But as the story of the country had it, most of the people who lived in these lower regions were descendant from enslaved people, because a lot of them were displaced from Africa and got to Colombia in slave ships, stayed on the coast, or in mining regions, which are also like not up in the mountains. So it was a way to like prove that racism was like okay to think, to think those things was okay. And this happened in everywhere in Europe too, like, but there's this specificity to Colombia and to South America because there are no seasons. So it was like about the altitude and the weather. So I was thinking about like how the geography in the country kept us separated, starting with this guy who had a deep influence in the way we think still about the people who live in the coast, for example. But also like more geographically. So there's this thing called El Tapón del Darién, the Darien Gap, which is like the densest jungle between Colombia and Panama. Just like a wall of jungle, basically. But like lately, people have to cross it to be able to migrate to the north, towards the north, and into the United States. So, as you know, Venezuela is going through economic and political crisis. We have received millions and millions and millions of Venezuelan migrants. And these migrants, not only Venezuelan, but also Colombian, or like everywhere around the world, they're trying to cross the Darien Gap by foot. This is only one of the horrible sort of like natural walls and political walls that they have to cross to get to the United States. But this picture is very strong for me because what used to be like a virgin sort of kind of jungle that was really hard to cross. No one's ever been able to build a road through it. Well, now it's a place that is full of stuff because these people, these migrants, they aim to like cross this jungle and they start to have to leave their stuff because it's so hard that they can't even like, you know, like have their clothes on their back. So it's just like these guys are like hanging out there with like all of these objects and belongings of people who have attempted to cross it. We don't even know if they made it out alive. So this is a whole series that this photographer Federico Rios, who's from Colombia, is doing on this specific geographical space, dividing South America from Central America, literally. And there are like pictures that are really horrible of people like that. Like these little kids, for example, they have to like walk and see people that didn't make it, that died. So it's really strong. Like it's horrible to talk about. But again, the idea that the forest is a sort of like veil, a curtain between one thing and the other, which is literally happening right now. But I kind of want to think about the forest in another way too. Not only as like a literal space of like division between city and countryside, but also like a metaphorical space. And so while in Western fairy tales, the forest is, and as analyzed by psychoanalysts in the early 20th century, like the forest was this space that symbolized the psyche, and it was a space in these fairy tales where the hero would go to deal with his ego, or like realize the ego's desires, or a space where you could like self-improve, sort of like the hero's journey. I don't know if you've ever read like stuff like Clarissa Pinkola Estes Running with the Wolves, or whatever the name of that book is, but basically it's like, okay, the forest in the fairy tales is where you go and like learn about your life, learn about your intuition, you learn how to be a woman, blah blah blah. So Western canon, going into the forest, basically like face to face with your ego and with yourself, with the self. But I'm like concerned with a different conception of the forest that is not Western European, blah blah blah. It's Caribbean, South American, and this works here that I'm showing is inspired by these conception of the forest, which during colonial times was literally a space for freedom from enslavement. And so maroon slaves, which were enslaved people who would run away from their owners, from their captors, essentially, and their abusers, they would use the space of the forest as space for freedom. And so these sort of like villages started to emerge in Colombia called palenques, in other places called barrios. They were founded as early as the 1690s, and they are still there today. But basically the resistance became so strong, and these spaces within the forest were so impenetrable. Like the power disbalance was so like not like the power disbalance would be like so tilted within the space of the forest, like it put like the white man in such a disadvantage that the forest was literally the space for freedom. So I said a place of freedom, of transformation, of conflict, because of its opacity, the dangers it presented to the Spanish made the forest a space where power imbalances could be balanced out. Yeah. So this is the town that remains, is the biggest one. There are others, but so like they became so powerful that they had to create treaties with the Spanish. So the Spanish essentially had to use diplomacy and let them exist in the midst of slavery times. So yeah, and this is something that I want to close with, because I was thinking about like the Firebox, the X, and the possibility of a different kind of exhibition space that wasn't called like the white cube or like plethoric, like the black box. And the forest for me is a good metaphor to think about the future of exhibition spaces, or like the kind of exhibition spaces that I want to work around, just because I would like the exhibition spaces to function as forest in a way that they are spaces for freedom and to tilt power disbalances, spaces that are opaque, that do not need or necessitate us to explain what our identity is or like perform our identities, but where we can like fully be not one thing but many things. And so I wanted to close with a quote. This is a quote by a scholar called Celia Britton, who is in this essay that I'm about to read from. She's comparing two Francophone writers, Edouard Glissant, who's from Martinique, Black, and Michel Butor, who is from France, white. And they both write about cultural difference. But like her point is that they are writing about cultural difference from different perspectives. That's not that important. I want to contextualize a little bit what I'm going to read. She's talking about Glissant's concept of opacity as a relational concept. And she says, this relation is exemplified in a scene in the novel, a novel called Le 4e siècle, the 4th century, between the transported African Longué and the plantation owner from whom he escaped on his first night as a slave. So they meet, right? First night as a slave, Longué escapes from the plantation owner, and they meet again. Many years later, they meet in the forest and have a conversation, not in Creole, but in their own languages. Even though Longué has not used his African language for 10 years, so that neither can understand what the other is saying. From this encounter emerges a mutual respect and even complicity, both enclosed in their own damage and mutually unattainable, as if they were veiled of instinct, the indecency of trust, or as if, since they were forced to trust each other, they still aimed to preserve their free will, or more humanely, their aloofness. So basically, Longué meets with his captor that he escaped from 10 years ago. But because they are in the space of the forest, neither of them have to speak the same language. They speak. And because they are in this space, they are not bound by these same rules. So the plantation owner isn't like, okay, I'm gonna catch you. He's like, okay, we're in the forest. Rules are different here. And that's what ideally the Firebox space would be, right? Where all these sort of like hierarchies, the hierarchies that I talked about before from the pyramid, would be tumbled down. Yeah, and I think that's where I'd like to end. I don't know if anyone has questions or they want to be highly critical. I welcome all sort of input.